And we now have our panel discussion. As usually, the moderator of the panel will look at the questions and then choose one or more of the speakers to be, who is the primary recipient of the question, and the other speakers can make a comment, and that hopefully will, being that we're so small, you can also then ask questions yourselves from the floor, which we usually don't do, but in this case, considering how small we are, we'll be able to do that this afternoon. All right, the moderator is Pastor Paul Bieber, who's the pastor of All Saints Lutheran Church. I know him from the Faith, Order, and Witness Committee in San Diego, and I know that his heart is totally in synchronicity with this organization for the Apostolic Church. And so we thank him and thank God for having us all work together. So Pastor Paul, let me pass this on to you.
Thank you, Father George, for that very kind interruption. And introduction. Those of you who are wondering what on earth is a Lutheran doing here, well, the Lutheran Church has an ecumenical trajectory, which is reunion with the Church of Rome, our mother, from whom we were exiled, and certainly the Church of the Augsburg Confession made as its first ecumenical act a translation of the Augsburg Confession into Greek so that it could be presented to the ecumenical patriarch, because we thought we might find a good hearing there. So I'm actually just continuing on with the ecumenical DNA of my church body. So having said that, we have only 3 written questions here. So you're going to, yeah, here we go. Here come more. An abundance.
Abundance of wine.
Well, that's all right. Oh, very good. Now, I'm not sure what it means that 3 of these questions are for Chris. 1 is for Mother Melania, and nothing that you said raised any questions at all, Father. Apparently that was all really just as clear as could be. But the first question, Chris, is a quibble. And it might be a good one. It says, is not the first century Didache the first writing for the family? You said that we had to get to the 1600s for something that was written specifically for lay people.
No, I disagree. The Didache is actually the first liturgical book for the most part we have in the church. Because see, I wouldn't, from my biblical scholar, I wouldn't accept that the house churches are domestic churches in the way we think of them today. They were actually, I disagree with, was it Zizioulis? They were Eucharistic communities from the Catholic point of view. The Didache is basically how to treat prophets who come in, how to perform baptisms, how to perform the Eucharist, and things like that. And so those house churches are not domestic churches in the way, at least, that the Catholic Church assumes a domestic church, like me and my wife and children in our home today. So no, I wouldn't agree with that, actually.
As a follow-on to that, the quibble that I was wondering on this same point as I was listening to you is, what about the Devotio Moderna? What about Thomas à Kempis?
Kempis, but it's the most, Imitation of Christ is the most, supposedly the most famous Christian book after the Bible. But again, he was writing as a brethren to brethren for the most part. I didn't say that these weren't used by laity. They certainly would be disseminated, but their audience was in fact other religious, other priests were who they were primarily writing to in these documents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, thank you. Mother Melania, with reference to stability, you said that moving from place to place won't help me with the fact that I myself am the problem. But can it be helpful to escape to a desert place sometimes if I'm stuck in a certain sin?
Yeah.
Succinct and to the point.
Okay, I'll go a little longer than that. Almost anything you say about the Christian life, there's another side to it, you know? So, I think there are times when we're stuck and we need to get away for a while. But it's wise to do it with counsel, because we, something in the fathers, all over the fathers, that sin is an insanity. And the more insane I am, the more I'm sure it's the rest of the world and not me. And so there's a lot of things that are good things, but if I'm doing it just based on what I think is wise, I'm quite likely to mess it up. So yeah, I think there are times when we do need to get away, but it should be done, with counsel, which doesn't mean talk to a whole bunch of people till you find the one who agrees with you. It's,
Yes, absolutely. And as you said in your talk, what are you running from and what are you running toward, right? In such a getaway. Okay, back to you, Chris. Would it be fair to characterize the role of the Third Order as a non-ordained functional diaconate?
I'm not sure, because generally speaking, the diaconate, as it's been reestablished in the Catholic Church, is still primarily, although through their training, it's interesting, through the training they go through, it's primarily activist oriented. They're doing ministries. But in point of fact, once they're ordained, it's primarily liturgical functions. And so in that sense, the Third Order doesn't really possess any unique or special liturgical functions to ourselves. We certainly pray the divine office every day. We take part in the same liturgy, but we ourselves, unless we also happen to be a deacon or a diocesan priest, wouldn't necessarily have the liturgical aspect of the diaconate. So mostly it'd be it's more akin, I would say. I mean, there are functions. I could see some connection with that, but I would see it more akin to what Father George was talking about in the domestic church, in that in the domestic church, you're trying to live by a very specific way, the evangelical counsels, in this case as specifically articulated by a particular rule. Because in the Western Church, we have, of course, many religious orders, each with their own rule. And so I'd see it more akin to that, because we don't really have any specific liturgical function or authority in ourselves.
Yeah, you're a confusing example yourself, because you actually do
I actually work for the
function
church,
in
so
the church,
yeah,
right?
so.
Exactly.
Vegetable. Can I just make a comment then about what the diaconate is in the Orthodox or Eastern Church? Right? The diaconate, the deacon actually is an intermediary between the people, a spokesman for the people. And so, for example, during the actual liturgy itself, the deacon will turn around and say, "Let us pray to the Lord," meaning he's taking the assembly and presenting that prayer, "Let us pray to the Lord." And other parts of the Divine Liturgy and other services, the parts that the congregation, and I wish we would get back to the congregation as a unity saying these things, would actually say that. So for example, during the consecration, while the deacon is on the altar, when the priest says the epiclesis, "Make this bread the precious body of thy Christ," the deacon will take his stacarion and point to this, meaning that in behalf of the people, that they are doing this. Make this, the priest is saying the words, on behalf of the people, he's pointing out to this. From a practical viewpoint, whether you're a married deacon or an unmarried deacon, if you have a secular job, it should be in an area that would be considered to be in charity, a ministry of some kind, like a teacher or something like that, a nurse, someone who cares for other people. And so, for example, to have an oil financier to be a deacon, that would be incompatible. All right. So in both your secular life, as if you were not a full-time deacon and quote employed by the church, and in your liturgical function, there should be some type of connection to Christ, either in practical ministry or in the liturgical ministry, and so on and so forth. I could just make that clarification.
Unless it's a financier who engaged in incredible philanthropy all the
Incredible philanthropy. You're gonna have to take that thing.
It's always the exception. So Chris, this and maybe the asker of this question will give us some background as to what's behind the question. But here's the question: do we truly live in an age of education, or is it rather sort of an age of undifferentiated information? So with regard to your characterization of the world we live in, would the asker of the question like to, go?
Well,
yeah.
You were saying how we have access to more information that's ever been available, just on our cell phones, and that's true, but I was reading a quote recently from Admiral Grace Hopper, the computer pioneer for the Navy. She said, computers deal in information, it's up to us to turn that into knowledge. What made me think about that was Sunday, my adult kids came over to visit for a late Father's Day, and we were talking about the anniversary of Apollo. They had brought friends with them, and two of their friends go, yeah, like that really happened.
Oh.
And they were serious. I thought it was a joke. They were serious. They think it was a hoax. And so we have more information available to us than ever. And I think you need information plus wisdom maybe to have knowledge.
That, I would agree with that, yeah. And that's why in another place in my talk, I did mention that I was just speaking among the laity in general, but I juxtaposed, I was saying we also have a lot of ignorance, and I think they go hand in hand. Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why we dumb down the SAT every year. Technologically speaking, we're this way, but yeah, our actual critical thinking, I would agree that I think the critical thinking of the average, at least American, is far below even what just last generation or the generation before that are, so that it's, I would agree with that.
Well, and Father George, you were also speaking in your talk about parents acting as gatekeepers for information in the domestic church and trying to help children to take a look at information from a Christian point of view.
Yes, I think we're going to be information challenged. It's going to take, for example, if you look at some of the examples, and here I'm not speaking politically, I'm just giving you an example because it was in the news. If you look at the Nancy Pelosi photoshopped presentation, or if you take, for example, what I saw recently this week was in the news, if you look at the father and daughter that were drowned trying to cross into, in one case we're technologically ignorant, and it's going to be very hard for the average parent, and we're going to have to rely on some external source that's trustworthy to be able to sort out what is, quote, photoshopped and false versus what is not. On the other hand, if you take, for example, I think that's a good example of the father and daughter drowned in that river, at Rio Grande, I guess, because one interpretation that I heard on the news was, look at the poor people that they had to undergo this, and the other interpretation is that if they had not tried to cross the border, it never would have happened to them. So in other words, here is the perception. Perception becomes the new reality. So which is even more important, I think, for a Christian parent to try to understand what the mind of Christ is. So that the mind of Christ and the mind of the church, in terms of interpreting things, if we can validate that it's true and not, quote, photoshopped, then how do we look at something like that with the fullness of the love that we should have as Christians, understanding the complexity of modern society, and so on and so forth.
And if I could sort of add on a little bit too, is one of the sins we talk about as Franciscans is synecdoche. I just like the word. to say it. But it's basically, and this it happens even more, it was always a challenge, but I think it happens more so in our age where everything's screens and online and you're anonymous to a large extent. And basically the sin is I see you through the lens of one thing that describes you, and for me that's all there is. So whether it's I'm Catholic, I'm Muslim, I'm female, I'm gay, I'm whatever, that's all I need. And from that point on, I know everything there is to know about you, and there is no mystery of the person. There is no, fullness of the image of Christ. There's just that, and now I know everything. And I think that's becomes even more dangerous in our age because, sadly, we fall into the trap of even self-identifying ourselves in those ways. So it's almost we do that ourselves. Well, I am a gay male, and so that's what I want everyone to see me as, or I am an evangelical Christian, or I am this, and so I think that's just another danger of the whole technological age. And I mean, that's the story of Scripture, though, right? Is that human beings are fallen. We were made good. We're still good as God created us in our core, but we are fallen beings, and every step along the way in technology has been, at the same time, one in the opposite direction. I mean, the first use of nuclear power was as a weapon. Most internet sites today, I think it's around 80 to 85% of some kind of pornography or something. So I mean, everything we take that comes from our human intellect and could be a thing to glorify God and help bring people together, it always has a sting at the end of it that we have to really take seriously and be aware of. I would say, just in a general sense, this age's great problem is many don't recognize the reality of the human capability for sin and evil. And I really think that's a thing other generations sin too, but at least in the back of the mind they thought, because we're evil, but we don't even just say that one anymore. We're just, there is no evil, or it's just different opinions or things like that.
Yes.
If I could make another comment on this, I think it's a big problem when I think we should give training to people to think rationally about something so they can answer a question. Who are you? What is your identification? I would like to have them say, I'm a child of God. And I try not to think of, rather pick up on St. Paul, neither male nor female in terms of who you are, not gay, not straight, not lesbian, not African or North American or whatever. No labels. You're all children of God, children of God. And then you happen to have a particular sexual orientation. All right, now you want to know the mind of Christ? By God's grace, I might be able to tell you what the mind of Christ is. It's your choice to accept it or not accept it. But I do think that labeling yourself and labeling others is a big problem. Now, I wear two hats. My psychology hat, I try to train people not to do anything like that, okay? To see the whole picture, and that focal point to the whole picture is, and I try to get that in the parish across, is that you're a child of God, and all of us are. Whether they sin or not sin, we're all the same, okay? And then we can talk about, going further and so on.
Thank you. As we come to our last written question, and maybe there will be more from the floor, this is a good opportunity for me to thank all of our speakers for the very thought-provoking and spiritually upbuilding thoughts that you've given us today. The last question, though, is a very practical one that I'd like each of the three speakers to respond to. This deals with what one theological mentor of mine used to call the street value of these theological ideas. And as a way of introducing it, I'll say my own personal reaction as I was listening. Jim was talking about his adult children coming home to visit, and as I was listening to Father George talking about how we ought to raise our children, and the other things that we heard in all of the talks, I found myself thinking, we really tried to do that, and in some ways we succeeded, and in some ways we failed. And of course, the outcome is never really quite completely up to us, is it? But it's in the difficult moments of our lives that that these teachings about interiorized monasticism, or I was thinking a couple times during the presentations, we're really just being urged to just lead a recollected life and kind of remember who we are. How does that, when we come up against a real obstacle in our lives, how is this going to play out for us? Here is the question. What should a Christian do who is in an abusive marriage? Who wants to take this one on first?
Mother take it, daughter.
Okay.
Mother Melania, you did show us how a cloistered sister can know a whole lot about marriage, because what you had to say about marriage had a lot to say about mine. So we'll give you this one.
Okay. You know, what I say about this now is not what I said about it 5 years or so ago, because I ran into some church teaching that I had to deal with. So I want to tell you something, and I'm not saying everyone go home and do this, but Saint Basil the Great, Saint Augustine, and Saint John Chrysostom they say that if somebody is in an abusive marriage, a woman, you stay there. Now, as far as I know, Augustine and Basil leave it at that. I haven't researched this exhaustively. Chrysostom is more nuanced. There is a place where he's sort of tacitly assuming that some people are not going to be able to handle this, and they separate. There is another place where he's saying to the woman, I forget which order he puts these two things, but at one point, and this is all in one place, he's saying, you know, you'll be highly admired if you stay in that situation, which would not work in the United States. So, but the other thing he says, and this is the thing that is like even harder to understand from a modern American viewpoint. He goes, stay there and you'll be a martyr. And so, and see, the thing is like, when people say be a martyr in the United States, it's like, yeah, you're a martyr, aren't you? Right? You know, it's very dismissive. Nobody sees a beauty of it. But St. John was offering that woman the most beautiful, most prestigious thing in the Christian life, is to be a martyr. But St. John also knew that not everyone was going to go for martyrdom. And so now let me tell you something. I was discussing this with one of a nun who was a spiritual daughter of Father Roman Braga, whom some of you may have heard of. He came out of the Romanian communist persecutions that, like, they made everyone else look like Boy Scouts. I mean, they were absolutely, totally horrendous. And so he's gone through unbelievably terrible things. And what this nun was telling me was his advice to Romanian women and his advice to American women was different. He would largely tell the Romanian women, stay there. And he would largely tell the American women, maybe it's good to get a separation or a divorce. And I think the reason is that the Romanians came from a culture, even though, I mean, they were still Orthodox enough, even this, or maybe because of the horrible persecutions, that they understood being a martyr. And so, in the context of our culture, I think there's so few people who can grasp that. And in a related issue, you know, one of the things that I learned from Mother Victoria, who is our abbess at St. Barbara Monastery, you know, this is like the two things a monk should always do, which is never do your own will and always take the blame. And it's like, but, you know, you can't start there, because most of us always do our own will and never take the blame. And when I say that, there's always somebody going like, I never do my own will. You know, this is, what's that called? The person who's, the person who needs to be an Al-Anon, who never does her own.
Codependent?
Codependent, okay. So, and that's, you know, I am much more likely to be a codependent person than I am to, you know, like, I'm gonna do this and I don't care what anyone thinks. And so, speaking as somebody who suffers from this is something I've learned about the idea that I never do my own will. You know, if I had my way, like, chocolate would be a health food that you had to eat 10 times a day. But, like, I don't live in that universe. And so I don't get chocolate without consequences, right? And so what I think we don't understand about the choices we make is we are always picking a mixed bag. And so what I think I'm picking, you know, it's like, so say, you know, like for a trivial example, say, you know, there's someone that, you know, you always go out and do things with, and you always do what they want to do. You know, it's like they want to go to the football game and you want to go to the opera, but you always go to the football game. So I'm thinking, I never do what I want, because I always go to the football game and not the opera. And what I failed to see is there was something I wanted more than to go to the opera. And I wanted it enough that I was willing to go to the football game, although I hate football. And so I think the thing is if we're in an abusive situation, I mean, I'm not saying that's, you know, that is terrible. It's terrible. But I think we also have to look at ourselves and go, what was it that I wanted enough? You know, maybe, I mean, a lot of times, you know, I'm totally clueless about myself and I don't know what it is. And maybe, I mean, but I'm just trying to pull all this together and just say, it's just there's just a lot there. And so I think there's just not many, I don't think there are many women in our culture who can grasp for martyrdom. And I think to try to force them into it is foolish. Father?
If you don't mind, I'd like to just share a case with you. And Father George, you can pick me apart if you want. I'm not a psychologist. I had in my parish in Akron, Ohio, many years ago, a couple. The husband was a gambler. And the wife was working 3 jobs to try to keep up with the funds to keep the family together. And I'm bringing this up because there are different kinds of abuse that we have to deal with in our society. And I could see she was collapsing. I says, you need to come and talk to me and tell me what's going on. Why are you working 3 jobs? Why are you so totally 100% exhausted? She was very dedicated to the church. Her husband attended on occasion. And so she told me what was going on and that he gambled everything away, and she was trying to keep up with the bills. And I said to her, you need to become legally separated from your husband because his debts are your debts. And I says, that doesn't mean your marriage is over. But you simply cannot be legally tied to this man any longer because he's going to kill you. Little by little, he's killing you now. So she did file for divorce. When the divorce went through, she found that he had gambled away everything, that there were liens filed by other gamblers against the house. And in the end of the whole story, she got nothing, absolutely nothing. And she had to go rent a small apartment somewhere to live. She still had her jobs. She quit one of them, thank God. I told her, this does not end your marriage. You're still married in the eyes of God to him, and she was good with that. She loved the man, but she couldn't live with the man. And she never ever divorced. She finally died, and I think he died too. But the marriage, on a spiritual level, continued. It just wasn't. She was not legally bound to him any longer, and it's a good thing because there would have been nothing left of her if she had stayed with him. So there's so many different kinds of cases today, and they're all unique, and a spiritual advisor, I think, is extremely important, and you have to look at all aspects. Yes, Father George.
If
I know you're
it's
gonna-
interesting,
I
I'm
knew
going to
you were
jump ahead of
responding.
Chris here, I'm sorry. But I was going to answer that in the following way.
Yes.
I'm going to put my psychology hat on here. Okay, take abuse. Abuse is an abstract term, okay? We have what we call a behavioral definition. That means that we want to know what does the person say or do, when and where that is considered to be abusive. Because it's such a general term, it could mean anything. So abuse, say Basil might be using it, or say John Chrystosom might be using it, might be behaviorally very, very different than a particular case of abuse that we come across in a particular case that we're dealing with. And I'll give an example. I have a patient right now, I'm not going to mention the exact country, but I'll give you an example. I have a patient right now whose father and her came from Eastern Europe. And the father has a severe drinking problem. And it's very, very difficult for the mother to deal with that, and for the daughter is my patient, very difficult for them to deal with it. But in the spirit of martyrdom, the mother and the daughter are there and doing the best they can to stay in the marriage, because culturally, in this particular area of Eastern Europe, this is relatively common, even though it's a horrific situation, but somehow they've learned to deal with it, okay? On the other hand, compare that to, let's say, a typical case that you might get here in, let's say, from someone in an Americanized society, where abuse might have a completely different definition behaviorally, all right? And obviously, if it's a case of a person being hit, which is a crime, by the way, and as a psychologist and mental health practitioner, I have to report that, okay? If it's said to be a confession, I can, but I have to report that if it's a physical abuse or if it's a sexual abuse. And psychological abuse is a category of abuse which is considered to be, is a real category. And that's sort of what you were describing, the gambling plus the consequences of that. And from a spiritual point of view, the person is married. Now, in the Orthodox Church, you know that for infidelity or abuse, at least our bishop will give a dispensation. The person could have a second marriage, and so on and so forth. So, but the person does not have to live under those circumstances. So I do think that, yes, if the person can be, if it's something like with it, it's what we would look at it as horrific situation to live in with an alcoholic and so on and so forth. But if this is the culture that they came from, somehow they're adapting, and through some type of good spiritual counseling, enlightened spiritual counseling, and psychological counseling, they can get through it. God bless, and hopefully they will do that. But if it's something which is intransigent, something that won't change, where there's some really, just affirmative consequences and so on and so forth, then I think that really has to be addressed, and so if that helps.
Chris?
Yeah, I don't really have anything big new to add. A lot of what I was thinking went along with Father Morelli, that in a general sense, our obedience and the people who have true authority over us, a pastor to his flock, a minister to their people, parents to their children, husband to his wife, in that understanding, we have to realize that Francis was very strict on obedience. Obedience meant obedience as you were told, as they wanted it, for the reasons they wanted it. And we have to realize that in obedience, that means if the superior tells me something that's stupid, I have the right to say, I think there's a better way to do that. And then when they say, no, you do it this way, then I do it. However, no superior ever has the right to ask you to sin or to commit sin upon you. At that moment, for that particular part of their obedience, you cannot obey. You still must be respectful, you still must show those different things, but you cannot obey a call to sin no matter who asks you to. And so, I think a lot of times, as Father Morelli is pointing out, and I think from Mother as well, that, not to play the thing of it's cultural, but there is a large cultural significance to how people will be able to deal with things. And I think certainly if we're in a marriage in the Orthodox and Catholicism, how they hold the sacrament and that dignity of that marriage needs to, at all costs as we can, be kept intact. But we need to, it needs to be recognized that, like Father Morelli said, and I was thinking, there's so many different kinds of abuse. Some should not be tolerated because of the violence and just the ongoing aspect of that. Psychological abuse can be so broadly understood that you're in a whole different category that I don't think we could just make one blanket rule. But I would say a lot of it would also depend on what the person themselves can honestly accept, in a situation of real it's really a misuse of the power that's being placed upon them. Some people, if it's more that just makes life a little difficult, well, that's understandable. If it's something like the loss of your life either through direct violence, or again you get more to the area like Father James was talking about, and it's killing you slowly. I guess the final thing I would say is, from the Catholic's perspective, is very similar, I think, to the Orthodox, and that is no one is required to stay in a marriage or to not seek divorce. Although again, if it can in some way be worked out through spiritual direction, marriage counseling, whatever, that should always be a hope and a try. But if it cannot be, the Church has nothing about people having to stay in a marriage like that, where their life, maybe their spiritual life is in danger. If the marriage is meant to the domestic church, and the spouses are helping one another get to heaven, and they're educating their children so that they'll come forth and hopefully, develop their own spiritual life. Well, when you run into a situation like that, where there's such a discontinuity between the reality of the sacrament and what it's supposed to do, when it's turning someone, possibly turning them outside of the faith, away from then I think that sometimes you have to seek those alternatives that are either I separate and I'm not with the person, or even divorce if that's a requirement. I'm not a psychologist, I don't have any of that background and such. That's just my kind of reaction that I would.
Based on your comments, Brother Chris, I just think maybe for a future topic, we should have a workshop on getting our children to heaven.
Getting what, Father?
Getting our children to heaven.
Oh.
And this is something, whether you're a monk or a monastic or a priest or a lay person, we all have this vocation. And we're not doing a good job at that. And I think future workshop might be helpful where we looked at that.
Can I just make one comment, and this relates to what Pastor Paul said? You know, we can lead our children, but freedom is always there,
Yes.
all right? And so therefore, you can set the groundwork, you can nurture the soil, but it's up to the plant to grow, and that's free will, which God gave us.
Yes.
And so if you did a perfect job as a parent, you could literally, I mean, if there was someone looking down, giving you a parenting test, and you scored literally 100% in every way, never made one mistake, the child could still make an act of the will to go and do something askance in some way.
God did a
You see?
perfect job as a parent.
So
The problem-
that,
The problem is we're just not doing the job
yeah,
in.
but at
in
least we
teaching.
can
We need to
nurture the
learn
ground,
more
yes.
about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful idea, Father James. My wife would come to that. She would be the woman over in the corner weeping, saying, "How did I fail?"
And that's where
It's-
we need to become examples, all Christians,
Yes,
because it's the
that's
witness
correct,
that will
yes.
bring people forth,
right.
not the teacher, if the teacher's not also a
Yes,
witness.
but we're having more and more people walk away, and we have to ask why. And of course, that's one reason, we're not living it ourselves.
No, I fairly often, which is funny since I'm a nun and never married and have no children, but I fairly often will have people say to me, like, my kids are grown and I messed up and what can you do? And I always say, you know, the one thing it's never too late to be is an icon of repentance.
Mhm. That's
You
right.
know, because, I mean, and anyway, if my parents were perfect, then I wouldn't have the example I need of imperfect people who keep going, you know? So I mean, that's, you know, but I agree with you, Father James, that's important. I do also want to just, as I understand it, when I was talking about abuse in the terms of Chrysostom and Augustine and Basil, they were talking about beatings. Yeah, but again, it's culturally a different situation than ours.
Who among you is moved to ask another question of our illustrious panel?
Melody.
Here comes one.
I think I have some simple questions, and I think it's for Father. You use the term tonsure, and I know what that means in terms of,
Oh, tonsure.
yeah, what does that mean?
No, but you snip a piece of your hair. Now, if you look at like a Benedictine monk, okay, but they take a very large swatch. We usually just, in our baptismal service, we just take we take a little scissor and cut a little piece of hair, which is a symbolic notion of the dedication of that individual to Christ. It's called tonsure.
Well,
Okay,
I
you have
knew
ever
what-
seen a
I
monk
knew it
with
was
the whole,
cutting, yeah,
it's
but
bald
what-
completely on top? Okay.
When you refer to somebody being tonsured, are they being ordained or something?
No, it's just part of our baptismal service.
Oh, it's the baptismal
Yes, the
service.
baptismal service, you
Okay.
tonsure, okay? We take a
Okay.
little snip of the hair, whether it's a male or a female, a little snip of the hair, and there's a little prayer we say, and that's the spiritual meaning behind that. And then, of course, in the monastic life, it becomes more of see, the Orthodox Church doesn't have the same, in the Roman Church, you have 7, quote, sacraments. You know, many Orthodox would rather call them mysteries, okay? And that there are more mysteries because a mystery is a channel of God's grace. So we have, in the Eastern Church, we have a notion that there are more than 7 mysteries. While the major mysteries are baptism, Eucharist, et cetera, you know, the tonsuring would be considered to be, for the monastic, would be considered to be a special, you know, mystery also, and so on and so forth, okay? Mother Melania could probably talk about that more better than me, but that would be something, but you do have these extra channels, and you give of yourself, and then you receive the grace of God through that particular, you know, external. It's an external ritual, but it's the sign of the grace that comes down from the Holy Spirit to you, and so on.
To clarify though, Father George, in the Eastern Catholic churches, the Byzantine Rite churches, tonsuring is a part of an ordination ceremony as well,
Yes.
like
Oh, okay.
for the subdeacons and deacons and priests. I don't know if it's for Episcopal ordination.
We don't, the Melkites anyway, we don't do it, most priests don't do it at baptism anymore.
Okay, we do it in our,
And
my
I had
diocese.
a discussion with an Antiochian priest over this at a baptism of his grandson, which I was doing, and he became very animated. And he also didn't want me to disrobe the child at the beginning of the ceremony. So I stopped the service and I said, come with me over to the office. And I sat him down and I said, look, I was educated in an Orthodox seminary. I consider myself Orthodox. And I went and I pulled down the Evcologian from the shelf for the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, and they had no tonsure, and they had the first thing at a baptism, you remove the clothes of the person to be baptized. And he looked at me, well, this isn't what we do in Jordan. And I says, okay, that may not be what you do in Jordan.
In my
but
archdiocese, we do the tonsure.
yeah, well, they just haven't
Yeah,
eliminated
yeah.
it, and maybe they
There's
never
some-
will, which
there's
would be
some-
fine.
Yeah.
But in modern practice, it's kind of for that particular instance. And you're exactly right. It makes you a little monk in a sense. Am I wrong?
I think it fits beautifully with this
Yeah.
topic.
Yeah.
Material has been
But,
estimated.
It's faded away to some degree. And of course, we don't have monasteries and monks as much as we used to at one time either. So that's another story.
He became very animated. What a lovely euphemism. There was another hand. Yes, ma'am.
From Melania. Could you elaborate on the comment very end about the single life needing place of accountability? What?
Well, it's hard. It's hard in the single life to find that. But I think that one has to start within your own church. And to have somebody, I think, that relies on you. You know, whether it's, you know, someone in a nursing home that can always count on you to come every Friday if that's what you have agreed on, or, you know, cuddling babies in a hospital or something. But and however you do it, I think it is difficult. And speaking as somebody who was single until my late 30s, before I'm still single, but I was living in the world single. It's just, you need something that's gonna keep you from just doing your own will and thinking you're a really wonderful person. And how that works for each person, I think, is different. I have a friend who really seriously tried that, and she really hasn't come up with anything that's working great for her. So, and again, that's, you know, because there is a very built-in responsibility that, you know, I know I'm dodging.
To me, it almost sounds like, as long as you have a set schedule that, you know, you need to be up and at work or whatever, that's the accountability you were talking about? You know, where you know you need to be at a certain place at a certain time, and, you know, which you're gonna be doing a certain job.
Well, something a bit more than that. I mean, it's more about, like, just speaking personally, I was pretty much my own God. You know, I mean, because it was like, when I was tired of people, I could just run away from them, you know, and I could, I didn't have to deal with myself. I didn't have to deal with just how selfish I am, and I I mean, I pretty successfully hid that from myself. And I think, and what happens in our day and age, because we don't, you know, we don't have a love for the struggle anymore, and because we don't have a love for the struggle, it's easy to leave a marriage, it's easy to leave a monastery. But in the monastery or in a marriage, I think you have to sacrifice yourself, and you're either gonna sacrifice yourself with love, or you're gonna sacrifice yourself not with love. And I mean, it's not either or, right? I mean, we all have bits and pieces of all of it. But it's easy to be a Pharisee. It was very easy for me to be a Pharisee living alone. And so that was that's what I'm trying to point at, is like, how can I stop being my own God, stop being the person whose opinion matters the most to me is mine. And I'm not saying, you know, I mean, one has to do what, you know, I can't go against my conscience, but over time I've learned that my conscience gets seared relatively easily, and it's more seared when I don't have people right there to tell me how seared it is.
Right, if I may, I think the kind of accountability you're talking about, Mother, has more to do with having a spiritual friend or a spiritual director,
Yes.
somebody who can,
Yes.
whose eyes can look into the places that I don't want to see.
Yes, yeah. But I think in addition to that, there's just also, you know, like being responsible when I don't want to be responsible.
Mhm.
And that was sort of why I was talking about the thing with, you know, if there's someone in a nursing home,
Yes.
or, you know, it's someone that does depend on you. And then I can learn how to deal with, like, I really don't want to go today. And she said something that really hurt me last week, you know, but nevertheless, you know, I'm gonna repent and go.
If I may, yeah, I mean, I understand that. I mean, I think it's the spiritual accountability we're talking about, and the integration into a community, in a faith community of some sort. One, on your own, you're gonna be bombarded far harder than you'd be able to stand with others. And two, I think, I mean, in the West, we've perfected selfishness to an art, but that being said, I still think there's still the inbuilt sort of things within the marriage community, within the, you know, the clerical life, within the religious life, that at least, like you said, point you to have to do the responsible and right thing. I mean, you know, when I was married, that was the first shock. I'm like, wow, I've been doing whatever I wanted for these last 20 some odd years. Now I have to do other stuff. And then each time, then the first child's born, and I'm like, wow, I need to like learn that I have a little even less time and stuff. And then you think you're good with that. And then all of a sudden your second kid's born, and you're like, oh man, you know, it never ends. There's always that interior kind of selfishness. And I don't think necessarily single people are more selfish per se. I just think there's more dangers in that life. I think I agree with Mother that we just have to be very careful. If you're living a life I think there's a reason why the church consecrated one form of life, made the other one sacramental, is that, you know, the single life by itself is a very difficult one of where you fit, you know, and to keep that faith alive with yourself. I can turn around and do things as I want them, and to extent, and I'm doing good works, but if I'm doing what I want to do when I want to do it, how much am I really following God's will, even if it's, quote, spiritual things? And I think that's the danger. At least that's what I understood when I heard Mother speak of the single life and needing accountability. Sorry if I don't want to put anything in your mouth that I didn't
That's
say.
it, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so this question's kind of going to be for whoever wants to answer it. So, Chris was mentioning the religious priest versus the secular priest back in history, in the West at least. And I was wondering how that compares to the Orthodox idea of the celibate priest and the married priest, or at least this idea in the Oriental Orthodox Church, where the celibate, or like a priest who's a monk. Is there any comparison there?
They wouldn't have been the same correspondence, because the secular priest is just what we call the diocesan priest today.
Okay.
And I mean, it depends what time you're looking at in the West, because there would have been married clergy, and there are married clergy in the West today, actually thousands, to be honest, but they're Eastern Catholics or they're Anglican transplants or other groups, but they're not the same. They're not the same thing. So I can't speak to the Orthodox difference, but that's not what that meant. That simply meant that there was the quote religious priests who were priests in the religious orders, and then the diocesan priest. The term back then was just secular, because religious in that time period didn't refer to, as we mean it today, just anybody who's faithful. It specifically meant someone who was under a regulated, consecrated rule of life that they lived. So that's what I meant. As far as the Orthodox half of it, I can't answer that one. The difference between married and celibate clergy.
Well, most of the priests are in our that I know of in our archdiocese, and in the other dioceses are married priests, and only an unmarried priest can become a bishop. And in our archdiocese, you have to be able to speak Arabic, which I cannot speak. I have to speak Arabic, and you have to graduate from a theological seminary. Now, those are specific rules for our archdiocese here. But the basic rule is that we had one bishop whose wife passed on, who's now one of our bishops, Bishop John Abdullah. Okay, and when his wife passed on, he was very, very popular, a very spiritual person, and he was consecrated one of our bishops. But we have very, very few, and we feel that the benefit of having a married priesthood is that there's an understanding of the dynamics of the family in a parish. That's on the plus side. On the minus side is that you have to take care of a family as well as the parish, and so on and so forth, and integrate your wife and children into the parish as well as yourself, the priest. So there are those pros and cons there in terms of that.
May I ask you something real quick?
Yes.
For the married priest, they have to have been married before taking
Yeah,
orders,
have to be
correct?
married before taking getting orders, and for the diaconate as well.
So you don't have the problem like Protestant churches do of dating the pastor.
You don't have,
Yeah.
well, if
It's
you
a real
do, then
issue,
you know what it is.
that's one of the abuses,
thing.
and then
Right. Sorry.
Now, keep in mind that in general, Orthodox churches are parishes are much smaller. Now, in, like for example, Monsignor Dennis's parish is huge, okay? The only parish I can think of that's anywhere like that around here would be St. Paul's at Irvine, was for the Steve C. Cleese. And even St. Constantine and Helena, the Greek church down in Cardiff, isn't quite that large, nowhere near that large, and St. Spiridon. So the parishes are very much, Orthodox parishes are generally smaller. The basic rule is, although it's changing in a few places, but the basic rule is if you have, a priest is only allowed to say one liturgy per day. So if you have more than one liturgy, you have to form a new parish. Okay, you have the theology here is that you have one Christ, one body, and the body of Christ is the parish in that community, and so you have one Eucharist, one body, and so on. So it's more than I can get into right now in terms of that. But if you have more than one, now our cathedral parish in Los Angeles, because they have several assistant priests, they do have a liturgy because the Metropolitan approved it. You have a liturgy in Spanish, which is a missionary outreach, and you have an English liturgy and an Arabic liturgy. So they do have three, but that's very, very, very rare. Here in San Diego, we have two Antiochian parishes, mine, St. George's, which is essentially Antiochian, and I'm the nominal Anglo, Even though I'm Greek on my mother's side and Italian on my father's side. And then we have St. Anthony's, which is mainly Americanized for American people, and so on and so forth. Still
When there is more than one liturgy, it's, I mean, best if it's another altar, but sometimes with the intermention, they'll do a different intermention.
Yes, it can be, yeah. And sometimes it can be on another altar, that's right, Mother Melania. And sometimes at another altar, a side altar with another antimens. An antimens is it looks like the shroud of Christ. I'm trying to think of the Western Christians here. It looks like our Lord entombed on a slab. Okay, it's called an antimensium, and is signed by the bishop, proving that this is an extension of the bishop being the principal, the high priest, etc. Okay, and
the relic.
each parish gets that. Each parish gets that in order to perform a liturgy and so on. So in the case of, I'll have to ask our deacon. Actually, his father is the pastor there, Father Michel Nidru. He's an archpriest, and he's a economos, which is a level higher than an archpriest in our archdiocese. I'll have to ask him whether they have 2 or more antimens, because they have 3 liturgies. So, but that is correct. You could have 3 antimens and several side altars. But generally speaking, you don't do that. You know, I'd say 99.9% of all the Antiochian parishes only have one liturgy.
Austin, just one thing I want to point out that you didn't bring up is there is a unique dimension to having married clergy. A family tempers I think Brother Chris will agree with me. Having a family tempers the personality of the father or the priest. When a wife or a child comes up and says, "But Daddy," or wife says, "You know, you could have done it better," it's an important dimension that a married clergy brings into the life of a parish, whereas us celibates, we have no one to temper us. And I recall on numerous occasions my secretary coming to me when I was pastor in Orange County and saying to me, "You know, Father, you're too rigid. You could have done this differently and not sent the people packing." And I really appreciated her intervention. I kind of wish she would have said something before I got started.
If nothing
But
else, it keeps us humble.
I mean, to be honest with you, there's a reason why we have married clergy. It tempers the personality of the spiritual leader of the community. It's a source, as Mother Melanie said, of accountability. So that's why. And celibate priests belong in monasteries. That's where they belong. They could be outside of a monastery or help serve, but they really need a community too.
So in a way, it does kind of relate to the secular priest being the priest of the parish, and the religious priest being the monk or the
In
celibate.
terms of function.
Yeah.
In terms of function, not in terms of.
Yes.
In terms of the Catholic Church, this November is the next Synod of Bishops, and it sounds the topic sounds odd. It's on the Amazonian basin, but it's going to deal with ecology and the Church's teaching on creation. But one of the big things that has been behind the scenes in the last 10 synods, but never was put on paper, but this time it is there's something called the Patris Viri. And so the bishops will be discussing in the Amazon to start as a test, will they ordain married older men who are elders in those tribal communities as priests? Because right now, despite in the West how we whine about the priest shortage, we have one priest in America for every 1,200, 1,500 Catholics. There they have one for every 6,000 Catholics. There are people who go years and never have a sacrament. And so it's not an ideological issue that so much divides in the West where we get on this topic, and celibacy and everything else. It's an absolute necessity. And so the Church, for the first time, at least in the modern councils and such, is really, that's going to be discussed by the bishops. Before, it never even made it to the first paper. but this time it will be, so.
I also had a question in regards to the celibate and the married priests. My understanding was that there were married priests and there were priest monks, and that something happened in the Middle East that made that difficult, and you got celibate priests who weren't priest monks. And like in the OCA, which I'm part of, and I think in the Russian tradition at large, you like a celibate priest is at least a Rheosophore monk. Now, he may not have spent much time at all in a monastery, but like Bishop Basil Essay, right, when he was not a monk, and he was already a bishop when he became a monk, and in his case, I think he had always wanted to be a monk, but I think if I remember, in his case, it was because he couldn't tonsure a monastic. I think I was the very first person he ever tonsured. And he was the one. Well, obviously he was the one that tonsured me, and he made this comment about the difference between tonsuring a monastic and ordaining a priest. Like, the priest is sort of ceremonially dragged, right? It's like you have somebody grab you on either side, and they, because it's showing that the church has made this decision, and you agree with the decision that the church has made. And when you're tonsured, like the bishop or priest monk who's tonsuring you, he has these the scissors, and he, if he's nice, he drops them on the floor. If he's not, he throws them, and you have to go get them 3 times. And the point is I am making this offering freely to God. It's totally of my own will. And I just, I remember that very vividly because he mentioned that right before I was tonsured. But anyways, it's 2 things at once there. But again, I think it sort of goes to your point about the celibate priest, is like, if you're a celibate priest who's in a monastic community, you're going to have somebody tempering your personality, and if you're a married priest, you're going to have somebody tempering your personality, and if not, you need a secretary.
You also have the parish council. So.
Parish council, there you go.
There was another hand.
That's okay. Would pass.
Well,
I have
yes,
a quick question.
sure.
I noticed that the Orthodox makes the sign of the cross one way, the Catholic makes it another way, and I don't think the Protestants make the sign of the cross at all.
We make it the Catholic way. We're Western.
Well, then I guess we're too, why do the Orthodox and Catholic make it different?
As far as I know, it's simply custom. And it's-
No.
No?
No. All God's blessings come from his right hand. And when you place the blessings as a priest on the people, you are going to your left because you're putting it on their right shoulder. If the people follow your hand as you're giving the blessing, they're going to go to the right shoulder. The symbolism of right is huge in the scriptures. When you leave the holy table for a procession, you go around the table to the right.
Yeah.
And when you turn from the holy table to give a blessing, you turn to your right to do it. It's just such a beautiful, rich tradition. The left hand is God's judgment hand. Think sheep and goats. So there's a very deep, rich spiritual symbolism to making the sign of the cross to your right shoulder first.
No, I never heard that for the lady, to be honest with you. For the priest and how we exit,
Mm-hmm.
and all that, absolutely, and how we bless. going around the altar and how we stand
Weddings
around the
go
altar.
around to the
I've
right.
never heard it for the people.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
weddings go to the
Franciscans,
right.
it's the three members of the Trinity, the two natures of Christ. He came from heaven to earth, from death, the left side, to life. So that's
That's another
the
one.
West, yeah.
We always turn to the right too, but nobody knows why.
And I should also point out, Father, that deacons will enter and exit the holy place
Yes.
always to their right.
Yes, if you look at the iconostas, you have the icon of Michael, Saint Michael, on the north side, and then the icon of Saint Gabriel on the south side. Okay, and so you always exit through because the altar itself symbolizes several things. It symbolizes paradise, heaven, the Calvary, the entombment, and so in terms of paradise, when you are expelled from paradise, you leave through the one gate, all right, because you face east, all right. But technically, the altar is supposed to face east, so you go out through the north door, and there's an icon. Now, the last time I was here, we had an iconostas here. They took it away. You can see part of the altar over here on my right. But you see the icon of Saint Michael, because Saint Michael expelled, our ancestral parents from paradise. And then Gabriel, who announced, to Mary, "You shall be the mother of God, thy will be done," so to speak. I'm encapsulating it. Okay, so it's through Gabriel and the mother's acceptance, the Theotokos' acceptance of that we can then re-enter paradise. So that's why we always, that's
Gabriel opened
fixed.
the tomb.
Yeah, that's fixed in theology and so on, so of the Eastern Church.
Again, a way it was explained to me is that it started out with the people doing it the way the priest was doing it. And then in some places, what the people started doing was mirroring what the priest was doing. So the priest was doing it in one direction, and they were just following him as if it was in a mirror.
Well, they saw he was going to the left, so they
So they
went
went
to the
to
left. That's all.
I never heard it for the
That-
people.
that's
I've
the way I
heard
heard
it
it.
across.
That's the way-
I've only heard it in what the priest does, never heard the term for people, all these years.
I was
Thank you
gonna say
for-
to throw a wrench in that, the Oriental Orthodox do it from left to right also. I'm not
Yeah,
sure
they
what
do.
their explanation is for it, but.
It's a Latinization for them. I don't think they
Copts-
always did
the
it that
Copts
way.
do.
I don't know about the Copts. The Syriac do that,
Syriacs do that? I can't
but
believe the
they're
Copts do
Latinized in many ways.
Topic for another, yes, please.
So last question I have, let's see, this one, I go to Mother Melania, kind of about the Ferrari.
That image really sticks.
So, like how does that work exactly? How can you have certain possessions and then know how to, I guess, have a relationship with that possession, but have your correct relationship with God and with other people?
I don't know. I mean, that's what we struggle with, isn't it? You know, it's like, I think that it's just helpful to have a lot of humility about the fact that we're very tied to stuff. And I think, you know, if there's 700 things that own me, I need to start getting rid of some of them. And one good way of figuring out where to start is what's causing the most pain and grief to the people around me. You know, am I yelling at everybody about my Ferrari? You know, are my children scared to get near my Ferrari? You know, so I think, you know, for those of you who are familiar with the book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent, right? So it's the ladder, not the pole vault. you know, it's like, and actually in the letter, I believe, there's a quote that's something like, if you see a young man rapidly climbing to heaven, pull him down before he breaks his neck. You know, and so, and I don't mean this in terms of like, oh, you just go as slow as you want and don't worry about it, but it's like, most of us, well, getting back to the thing about never do your own will and always take the blame, okay, so, and you can't start there, you know, cause you'll self-destruct and probably kill everyone around you in a very short order. But like, so, in terms of my possessions and also in terms of like doing my will, you know, there's something in my life that causes a lot of harm to the people closest to me. And that's a good place to start changing my will. And as far as taking the blame, I know I'm going past your question here, but like as far as taking the blame is concerned, it's like, we all have something in our lives we full well know is our fault, but like we're just too proud to admit it, or scared, or both. And then, if we manage to work through those things, like there's stuff where, you know, my parents and my brothers and my sister and my co-workers and everybody agrees it's my fault. And there's very good chance that they're right and I'm wrong, you know. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, from a practical sense, we don't have to get rid of everything all at once. I don't have to get rid of everything that I'm enslaved to right this moment. Now, I can repent of the fact that that I'm not. But from a practical sense, I think it just makes a lot of sense to start with, where am I causing the most harm to the people that love me the most? I think that's a good place to start.
Just maybe I could add, in the Eastern spiritual tradition, we have the toll houses after you die.
Yeah.
And the purpose of the toll houses is you will be shown the consequences of your action in other people's lives. And that scares me to pieces. And it certainly has made me rethink how I behave toward other people.
You know, speaking of the toll houses, I think the most brilliant retelling of the toll houses was C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce.
Yes.
That's exactly it. And it's like, we all struggle with something like a chocolate chip cookie that we'll put over God when push comes to shove. And and that book is brilliant.
My confirmation pastor gave me that book. It's a big reason why I'm dressed like this.
If I could just try to answer
Someone over here.
one simple,
Are we actually supposed to believe in toll houses, or is that just a kind of a story to bring across a point?
Yeah.
What is a toll house?
Okay.
There we go.
It's not a chocolate chip cookie.
No, that's actually, the sisters always tell me my big toll house is going to be the chocolate chip cookie toll house.
Toll house cookies.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. So it's this idea that there was I can't remember the name. There was a sainted nun who had a vision of her sainted elder, and there were these actual toll house, like these, little guys with demon guys with, have at tax booths, and that's what they're talking about. They're tax booths, and it was like, and you'd get held up at the tax booth of your particular sin that you had not let go. Now, within the Orthodox world, there's everything from, it's almost exactly like that, and you better be really scared, to there's no such thing. But I think the Great Divorce is exactly, that's the thing, is like, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Great Divorce, it's like, there's this bus ride from what's not quite hell yet to what's not quite heaven yet. And there's all these people in what's not quite hell yet, very few of who even bother to get on the bus to go see what's not quite heaven yet. And almost all of them choose to go back because there's something that they're so stuck on that they would rather go back to hell.
My favorite is the theologian who wants to get back to
Isn't
his
that-
theological discussion group.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the one.
Yeah.
In hell.
Yeah, so I think it's a very real thing, and in the sense of like, how could I possibly not hate heaven if I'm still attached to the things that are my loves outside of God? I mean, heaven would not be heaven to me. And so, and it's not like if I'm living my whole life here, just like, doing whatever I want and going like, well, God's gonna forgive me. Well, yeah, God's gonna forgive me. But what good does that do me when I don't love Him? And when, and so either here on earth or at the toll houses, whatever they are, I'm gonna have to say, I want you more, God. And far better to get as much of it done here as possible. Yeah.
I was gonna try to answer the question on poverty. If we make a distinction between, like in the Roman Church, you have solemn vows and simple vows. Solemn vows, you give up ownership, and simple vows, you give up the use, except if you have permission for something. And taking it to the spiritual level that we talked about, if you have something that you're using that's useful, if it's taken away, would I be sinning against someone? Well, let's say if someone takes something from me, would I strike out at them? That's sort of like a check, a daily check on myself in some way, okay? Like if someone takes my pencil, am I gonna yell at them or scream at them or do something that's uncharitable? That's sort of like a way of, I make my own exam of conscience type of thing. So if you can say that, I realize I have this for my use, and thank you, Lord, and if someone does take it away, then, or damage it in some way, if I had a Ferrari, would I take out my gun and shoot them? Would I do something, if you say no, I realize that no matter what happens, I'm gonna put love above even if I lose this particular item. Then I think you have the right perspective on these things, and that's the spirit of poverty. I don't know, that's how I sort of approach it.
That's what Franciscans would say too. They'd say you always have to be discriminating against yourself, because especially if you have possessions, because there's always the thing that, oh, I'm poor in spirit, but you're really not. That's the way you have to constantly ask yourself, am I really able to say no to these things? I may need them to fulfill a vocational thing. Married people need a certain amount of money that religious don't. They need to have things for their children. They need to have their house. There are things that need to be there. There even needs to be legitimate entertainment, and there's nothing wrong with having that. But once you start having a lot of stuff, you need to start asking yourself, well, why do I need 2 homes? Why do I need this? Why do I need... And legitimately, you may find you do, but I think it's that constant, always distrusting yourself a little bit, that what I think I am, as Francis says, what a person is before God, that's all he or she is and nothing else. In our minds, we all can be the holiest, most poor in spirit, most humble people. In reality, Francis' other statement was, if you want to know how humble you are, find the person who annoys you the most and stay with them for a week. He said, at the end of the week, that's as humble as you are and no more. That's who you are, because it's in the concrete life. And I think, I think just as a Franciscan in the West, in the modern West, I think that's one of the big challenges, is that the West, we're so wealthy. I mean, even our poor are wealthy compared to other countries. And it's way too easy to get caught up in such of the comfort and everything else that, in a sense, we almost have to go out of our way to do penances that in much of the world is just life. You know, we have to find a way to offer sacrifices to God. We have to find a way, because it really it does deaden you. I believe as a Franciscan, having lots of stuff just weighs you down, not just spiritually, even physically. You know, I have a lot of books, more than I need, and I know that. It's a joke between Father and I. It's one of those things I'm getting rid of slowly, working my way up. But, you know, sometimes I feel physically weighed down that I have all these things. Like, what am I gonna do? I need to get rid of this stuff, you know? And Francis has the story too that goes along with Mother's story about, you know, God just wants you to turn to Him right now and start loving Him. Don't sort of make the idea, well, I can't do everything until I give up all this, or I give up all these, not even just possessions, but whatever it is in your life that you're still holding on to. He says, take God with your right hand, and in your left hand, God will let you hold on to your blanket. That's what Francis said. And he said, and as you walk with God down in the forest, it was in Tuscany, you know, as you walk with God through the forest, at one point you'll realize you dropped the blanket along the way and you didn't even notice it. Whereas, well, I think like Sister said, Mother said, if you try to do it all at once and you're not really ready for that, you're going to turn right back around and maybe worse than what you were before, rebuy everything or leave. Or I think just really looking at possessions, you know, let me just say this, all three of the evangelical councils are as true today as they always were. I mean, how many times gluttony, how many times do you go to your refrigerator and open the door and look at it 20 minutes later? Nothing changed, right? Unless you went and bought a lot of food in the meantime, came back. We've become so complacent that everything, you know, people tell me I can't fast, and I say it a lot more diplomatically, but really the reason you can't fast isn't because it's too hard medically. It is for some, and that's true. But for some, it's you're too fat and lazy. Your body is so used to eating so much more than any human in the history of our world has ever eaten, that when you fast, oh, I can't handle it. No, you have to break through that. You know, a lot of it's just this, we let comfort do it. And that's what God warned Israel from the beginning on, right? Once you have the land of plenty, don't forget that I'm the reason behind that blessing and stuff. It's my blessings. If I become so involved in all the stuff, the possessions, the prestige, the power, the pleasure, and I forget that it's all from God and to be shared and everything else, I'm lost. You know, I'm heading down that other direction away from the Lord. So it's my Franciscan thing.
Notwithstanding all that you have heard today, you must still go to church tomorrow and hear a sermon. This is my opportunity to thank our three panelists for all the wisdom that you have imparted to us, and to thank our lovely audience for your attention and for your questions, and to say we have come to the end of this Light of the East conference. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.